This episode is brought to you in part by Samply. Samply makes the process of dealing with mix revision notes super easy. Make sure to check them out online at samply.app. And while you're there, get 3 months off any plan free by simply using the coupon code MYM at checkout. Hey, welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike Indavina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Matt Glasbey, and if you're not familiar with him, he is an engineer and mixer based out of the UK. He's worked with artists like David Gilmour, Alt J, Block Party, Madness, and a whole bunch more, and he does a ton of phenomenal work. And in today's episode, we dive deep into his journey in music production. Everything from starting off as a musician to making home recordings to eventually working in some really big studios like Peter Gabriel's Real World Studios, and then getting to work with people like Andrew Sheps, and then starting to work on massive projects like all the artists I mentioned and Ed Sheeran and a whole bunch of other great people. And his story is really interesting when you dig into it because there are so many lessons that you're going to hear along the way, so many decisions that he made that a lot of people would maybe be a little hesitant to do. But he took chances, and I think that's a really big part of his story, as you'll hear. And it's no wonder that when you take risks, when you push yourself to learn things that maybe you're not familiar with or maybe not comfortable with, you can actually see some progress in your life. And he's got an amazing story that I think you're going to find very fascinating. So we dig into all of that. And we also dig into his process when it comes to mixing, because he's got great mixes that have tons of depth, tons of width, tons of clarity. And I know that those are things that a lot of people listening to this struggle with. He has a really cool perspective on how he goes about approaching things like dealing with low end or creating contrast between various elements of the mix. And not just doing that as a static form, but also how he uses automation to manipulate settings throughout a mix to create even more clarity from section to section. So that's something that I don't hear too many people talking about on this podcast, but I think it's really important. And I think that he does a really great job of describing why he's doing it and what he's listening for. You could take a lot of this stuff and certainly apply it to your own mixes. So yeah, I think this episode is full of really, really good stuff. He's a great dude. We have a great conversation. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Matt Glasbey, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. What's going on, man?
Hey, Mike. Really, really glad to be with you, man. Thanks for reaching out.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with you, can you give us a little background on who you are, what you do, and ultimately how you got into music production?
Yeah, so I'm an engineer, mixer, more recently doing a little bit of production and writing, based out of London, UK. I'm in my studio here in East London. I kind of came through quite a traditional route into engineering. I kind of worked at a studio and then eventually, I'll get into this. I can go right back to the beginning if you'd like that.
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. I kind of started, as most people do, as a musician or learning to play music. I think really the first thing was the bass for me. I think I was maybe 9 or 10 years old and saw my brother in like a school play or something, and his friend was playing bass in the pit band, and I was just like, whoa, what is that? What is it's got this kind of groove. It's so powerful, and I was just absolutely hooked. So somehow I got some lessons off this guy, and I think for the first year or so I was just playing an acoustic guitar with 2 strings removed, just learning Red Hot Chili Peppers bass lines from like albums from start to finish. Just like really, really caught the bug, and I would just be in my room just playing bass for just like hours and hours every day. Like not really playing with, there wasn't that much music going on. There was a few things at school, like I ran some like funk and soul bands while I was at school, but there wasn't that much of a scene. I was kind of from like rural Midlands of the UK. But yeah, there was this one night my brother was having a house party, and to show how addicted I was to playing bass, there was a house party going on. I was upstairs just playing bass. One of his friends heard me playing and was like, man, do you want to be in a band? And this guy was like in his early 20s. I was like 15, 16. I just thought it was just the coolest thing in the world. Started kind of like playing venues around like our local Birmingham, and then to London, and I was just like, yes, this is amazing. And I just really, there was really nothing but music in my head. I mean, I'm sure my parents were really happy that I was like, yeah, I think I'm just going to play bass. I mean, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to see for the whole of the future. Yeah, I mean, luckily, again, that same friend who first taught me bass, he had started learning some sound engineering. He'd gone to school for sound engineering, and he'd said, hey, this is great, but if I had my time again, I would do this course at a place called the Institute of Sound Recording at Surrey. So I had a look there. It just happened that my grades were good enough to get in there. And yeah, I had messed around a bit with like some cassette 4 tracks. I don't think I'd even really discovered stereo until I was just about to head to university, to be honest. I was just kind of like getting that balance, recording a few of my own tunes, some kind of band stuff, but it was more just really, really bare bones. Like I didn't really know what I was doing at all. But actually, just before I headed to uni, the band that I was playing in, we went to go record an EP. It was my first time in a proper professional recording studio. It was up in Liverpool. I think it was Sandhill Studios at that point. And I was just like blown away. I mean, the engineer, producer there, he was doing all sorts of things. Like we had this little cassette tape machine that we liked kind of recording stuff on and off. And he like took a line out of that and put it in front of the drum kit to kind of use it as sub kick, and I was like, whoa. And then he'd, wired up a light sensor to kind of like modulate some of the guitar tones and things. I was like,
oh wow,
man,
cool.
This is amazing. Like it was magic. It was that proper first experience of the studio really being used as an instrument. And I was like, maybe this is something I could do. So yeah, I headed to university to go study, and kind of got a bit of a shock. I was surrounded by a lot of people that had really come from more of a music tech background. I'd come from more of a music background, and there was a good balance of people, but I just had to really, really study hard, and got to play with a lot more people then, got introduced to loads more music. I think before then I'd kind of been like funk and soul, indie rock, some kind of more classic rock stuff. I was a massive fan of Pink Floyd, like Zeppelin and things like that. But when I was at uni, I got really heavily into playing jazz. There wasn't that many bassists, so I was kind of just like playing, and everybody's playing loads and loads of different types of music, as well as like starting to record other bands. Once I kind of like got to grips with the studio, because I'd come from a place of not being sure what I was doing, then I was just assisting everybody I possibly could. So all the students be bringing bands in, and I'd just be like, put my hand up, yeah, I can come and watch what's going on, I want to learn. And like carried that through my whole time at university, actually. Yeah, to cut a long story short, there was a year in industry like halfway through the course. Somehow, I don't know how this happened, but they must have seen something in me, but I managed to get a job at Peter Gabriel's Real World Studios.
Oh wow.
Which was just like, as a studio assistant, which was again just another step up of just like feeling like I was a little bit out of my depth, but it was also just like so exciting to be, faced with all these new kind of challenges. And I'd have a little notebook in the back of my back pocket, and people would be like, oh yeah, can you do this, this, and this? And I'd be like, yes. Half of those things went in the notebook because I was like, what is that thing? I will find out what that is, stay up all night learning what that is, and then tomorrow morning it'll be done. And it's just that kind of constantly until I started really feeling like I was getting to grips with things. And that job was an interesting one because it was more in Peter's world than the main commercial studio. So I was doing a lot of archiving, looking after his writing room, the recordings and writing that he was doing at that point, as well as some sessions as well. But there was a fair bit of downtime where I was just experimenting. And I mean, you imagine I was 20, 21 maybe, just surrounded by all this amazing stuff that, half of it I knew what it was, half of it I knew how to use, and then there was this amazing, early drum machines and binaural head and all that, just through the night I would just be kind of experimenting with stuff when there wasn't more pressing stuff to be doing. And that was, I don't know, I think just trying out techniques, just like playing. Like, I think that's a really, really important thing to try and keep when you're in the studio, is this kind of sense of play, because the music is kind of created by people kind of like communicating with each other with their instruments and playing and trying things out and failing, and you might go down a big rabbit hole with trying to, and if you have the time, then that's fine. Obviously, if you're on session with someone else, then you probably don't want to go down those rabbit holes too often. But yeah, if you're afforded the time, then I mean, what the hell? Like, try a process that shouldn't necessarily sound good, or maybe you don't know that it's not going to sound good, and you can get to the end and be like, yes, that would really, really fit in this kind of track, and there you go, that goes in the bank. And I think I was extremely, extremely lucky to kind of have that time and learn from all the people at Real World Studios at that point.
That's amazing. I love that. It reminds me a lot of like when I went to audio college as well. I remember our engineering teachers, we would each get like 3 hours of studio time a week or something like that. And it could be in the middle of the night, whenever it was. But I remember our engineering teachers just being like, I'm not even going to tell you what to do or how to use this equipment. I want you to screw it up. Like that was his goal, was like, do things that you don't think should work, try it and see what happens.
Yeah.
There were some weird nights where we'd get really creative and, it was like start doing all these analog tape loops and whatever. We didn't know what we were doing. We were just trying things. And he was like, you're going to learn whether it works or not. And you're going to learn how to fix the gear if you break it. So it's kind of an important skill to know, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, if you take a risk, like say doing something really, really outlandish, and maybe, 9 out of 10 times it's just going to be like, well, that was kind of a bad idea. And then there's that one time where it's just like, okay, yes, this works. This is great. But yeah, so after that, went back to uni to finish my degree. And then a friend of mine had been working in a studio down in South Wales called Mono Valley, which is this beautiful large format studio with a beautiful drum room. And he'd heard that the engineer there was planning on leaving in the next kind of year or so, and they were looking for an assistant to then kind of take over from him eventually. And my friend had thought that I might be someone that would be up for it. So yeah, I managed to get that job, and that was really where things kind of took really sped up. I mean, it was a residential studio, so I was living upstairs, working downstairs day in, day out, doing the long hours, but just loving it. And had loads of amazing producers come through, especially after, say like a year or so after I took over as the head engineer there. Then again, very luckily, Andrew Sheps came to, well, he'd worked there before, but then he'd loved the room, but felt that the gear was a little bit lacking. And when he moved over to the UK, then this is where he decided to make his home. So he brought his 64 channel Neve 868, all of his racks of gear, because it's like, well, I'm not really using this anymore. It would be great to be somewhere where it's going to get looked after, it's going to get used, and people can make great records with it. And then when he had sessions where he was producing, or he was doing an instructional video or something, then he could come in and use it whenever he wanted, obviously, because all of his gear was there. I think meeting him and working with him on some of the sessions that he ran there, and also just like fault finding through the console. I mean, if there was, learning how to like line it up properly. I mean, I think one of my proudest moments as an assistant there was when an American producer called Brad Wood came in, and he ran a few tracks through the desk, and he was like, this desk is aligned so well. It's like I can run stereo through, and everything's like to the 0.1 of dB, like perfectly coming back. That's great. I was like, yes. It was like probably about 8 hours over the last like couple of days before he'd come in, just going through and adjusting each module and making sure it was all there. But yeah, just poring over the schematics with Andrew, and if there was a fault or something, it was just like I learnt so much. And yeah, there was some great producers came through there. But I was just wasn't really that interested in trying. Well, I guess I was interested, but I wasn't like focused on trying to be an engineer really ever. I just wanted to be the best assistant I could possibly be, and like that was kind of my goal, and kind of learning that way of trying to think ahead, just like always listening, barely ever talking, and just hearing what's the vibe going on in the studio. Something's referenced, or hey, maybe they talk about a particular record, or they talk about maybe an idea of a sound they want to try, and that it's just there before they've even had to ask you. I mean, there is, on long sessions, I mean, there was sessions that would go like 6 weeks. And yeah, during that time, there's various periods where you can just like nip out, and you've got that plus another option of something that maybe, kind of works and is in that kind of world, and be like, hey, I've done this, I've also got this, maybe you try it. And, 9 out of 10 times, it's like, yeah, that's great. Because, I mean, I really knew the room. And I think through that, then eventually there was a few producers based out in London that were like, hey, would you be up for coming to London to do some sessions? And obviously I was the in-house there at Mono, and I couldn't really leave, but it kind of got to the point where there was enough of these people that would be like, yeah, you should come to London and do these things, that I just decided to, this was after maybe like 2 or 3 years there, decided to kind of make the jump and go freelance. And when I first moved to London, it was probably had like 2 or 3 days of session work when I first moved to London each month. And the rest of the time, so I'd been doing some mix assisting for Andrew. And I mean, again, very luckily, I'd had a rig that we had essentially cloned so I could run open his sessions, run his sessions. In fact, I think when he was on your show, he said that he used to have someone in London. That was me. And I mean, that was, spending the time sitting with his sessions and seeing how he put things together. I just absolutely learned so much. I'd see something that I was like, well, how is he doing that? And try and just like visualize the signal flow and everything. So I had this rig, and I kind of started finding myself out as an editor, so people could send me like their drums, vocals, guitars, anything that they just wanted tied up, more in the kind of like pop world, because things, I feel like with editing, if you're doing something which is a little bit more organic, then the idea of farming that out to someone who you don't know really, really well is kind of tough. If you wanted something to be like, okay, this is the groove, everything kind of fits that, and you can kind of farm that out. But yeah, and from that, then I started getting, people started bringing me in to actually record stuff, because I just would get chatting. And I think there was one moment where I'd heard of a guy who was looking for an engineer, I think from a manager friend of mine. He like met him at a party or something. I'd kind of gotten in touch, just like, oh, hey, I'm in London, I'm about, if you've got any, grunt work that, you don't want to do yourself, then send it to me, I can do it. I mean, I'm one of those sick people who just loves doing little monotonous tasks for a really long time and then standing back and being like, wow, that sounds great. Now looking at all of that, those tiny, tiny little, very mundane movements. And he was like, yeah, cool, but then never really got back. And I was like, just email him again. And we kind of arranged to meet, but then that kind of time passed and all of that. So one day I just went to his studio and knocked on the door, and he was like, oh, hello. Oh, it's you. And then we had a chat, and then we just agreed to do some sessions together. And that happened to be an amazing producer called Joe Rubel, who at that point had just come off producing an Ed Sheeran record that had, I think it had something ridiculous, like 8 number ones in the top 10 here in the UK. It was like ridiculous. And so I kind of started doing this kind of grunt work for him, and then he started bringing me in on sessions. And once he saw that I could engineer and kind of knew what he was going for, then he just started kind of just letting go and kind of letting go of the reins a little bit, so he could just focus more on the musical aspects of it and all the kind of technical side of it. He's like, well, we're going to this studio, you sort out all of that, I'll turn up. And then, luckily he really liked what I was doing, so we kind of developed that kind of relationship, which is great. In fact, he's got a studio right next door to me now. So that was the kind of first kind of way in through that. And then actually got relatively busy, again, mainly doing some engineering for Joe and a couple of extra other producers, and just a hell of a lot of editing. And I joined a band just to try and like get back into that kind of musical world, get that bit of the brain going. And I was determined that I was just not going to that I was just not going to get involved in recording, recording it, producing it, anything. I'm literally going to just play bass, synth, write music, kind of just go the other side. And the band had just after a little while got signed to a small label run by a producer called Charlie Andrew, and we went in to record our first EP. But Charlie's engineer at that time, who was a friend of mine, had just moved away, so we were kind of stuck without an engineer. So I was like, okay, I'll step up to do that. It's a shame, but I'll do it. And Charlie really loved the way that it sounded, and he started asking me to other sessions, and we just developed a really good relationship. And after a little while, then we did some great records together. And it's kind of like mainly just working as an engineer between Charlie and Joe at that point, and not really thinking about trying to push the boat out, doing my own things. So I was quite happy just focusing on the technical aspects of it and trying things out. And well, the great thing was, once I'd kind of developed these relationships with these producers, then they kind of, again, just kind of gave me the reins, and I started to be more and more kind of creative with what I was doing. And people seem to like what it was that I was kind of bringing to the table, because I'd learned all of the kind of classic techniques of things, but there was so many times where it was like, oh, I just want something to sound a little bit unique, not because I work in a lot of kind of acoustic music, so music where things are in an acoustic space. You have to try and capture people playing real instruments, and it was a crossover of those styles of more programmed stuff and more organic stuff. So a lot of the time, my job was to try and find ways of kind of blending those, lots of reamping or treating kind of acoustic instruments as kind of sample, as you would like samples, but not in terms of the programming way, but the way that they sound, you know. Anyway, where did I get off? I've realised I've just gone on a rant about my life for the last little while. But
it's all good. No, but I find it really interesting. Like, I think that like one of the threads that keeps coming up while you're telling the story is this idea of taking chances. And I think that that's a really important lesson for people, is like, you have to take chances. And if there's things that you're not necessarily you don't know what to do, or like you've never done it before, like you were still always the person that seemed to just say, yeah, I'll do it and I'll learn it and then I'll just try it. And I think that that really, going back to like some of your earliest stuff that you talked about, like that seemed to have been the springboard for, getting you in the room with other people and then that becoming a new opportunity, or, even having people that aren't responding to your emails and then just being like, hey, I'm going to knock on your door. Like, that's a chance. That's a risk. And I think that that's a really cool thing to talk about, because, it goes to show your drive and your passion for this. And I think that that's something that a lot of people listening to this need to like find in themselves sometimes, right? Like a lot of people see this end goal in mind. Like, I really want this dream or whatever, but they're not taking the chances to do it. They're kind of waiting for stuff to come to them. And I think your story is a good example of taking those chances and taking those risks and just doing things scared. And I think that's a really important lesson. And it seems like through that experience, you get in the room with somebody, you impress them, you try something new, and like then they refer you to someone, and then it's just kind of been snowballing from there. And I think that's why you've had such a long career and been able to work on so many cool projects. It's just that you've done all of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of power in just saying yes to stuff, especially stuff that maybe you're not 100% that you can absolutely do, but you know that you might be able to do it, but you don't know unless you kind of just say yes and jump in with both feet, and I just have focus on what that next kind of stage is. Like if you start at the beginning of your career thinking, oh, I want to be a massive famous producer, then that's all of the little steps in the way are going to be kind of pretty hard, because you're going to be like, well, no, I want to be there. Why am I, just editing some audio from a sitcom or something? Like, but actually, everybody's route into the industry is just all over the place. From talking to people, no one's just had this like straight up down the middle kind of route to where they want to be. It's all just, well, I did this, then I did this, and then I met this person, and then we got on, and then they introduced me to this person, and then and it's just all those little steps, but just like focusing on what that next thing is, like be the best assistant that you possibly can be, and then try and be the best engineer, and then move on from there, see what happens.
Yeah. I love that you said that your goal wasn't to be the producer. It was to be the best assistant engineer, which I think is amazing, because most people go into it thinking like, I want to work my way up, and you're right. It's like when you only have your eye on like the prize, and you're kind of losing sight of where you are right now and what you need to do to take those steps to get there. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I've been extremely lucky with the people that I've met and worked with, and I mean, now to really be calling this a kind of steady career is just my absolute dream. But that wasn't the dream at the beginning.
Yeah, of course. So then fast forward to today, you're working on a lot of different projects. You're doing a lot of mixing work, and I'd love to dive into your mixing process and learn a little bit more about what you're doing there. Maybe we just start from the beginning. Like, when it comes to starting a mix, if someone sends you files or something you've been working on or whatever, like, what's your mindset going into it? Like, how do you start? Where do you start? Like, what kind of things are you listening for?
Yeah, so it really, really does depend. As you'll probably hear me say a lot, it's quite difficult to pin down. There's not like one specific way really ever on it on anything. But if it's something that I've been, as is usually the case, that I've engineered and then mixing, then the mix kind of starts in the studio as you're tracking. And if you're thinking about how you're going to balance things later down the line, at the moment that you're actually capturing, then that just absolutely pays dividends later on. If I'm just sent something completely fresh, which I actually much prefer because I don't have all the baggage of, oh, hey, there's this sound that was created this way, and I can just kind of have a complete blank slate. And perspective is just so important, because you'll never have that opportunity to listen to it for the first time again. Like, everything after that will be somewhat kind of coloured by the process. And finding a way to kind of reset is really important if you've been working on a record for a really long time, especially if it's your own music. I mean, my God, like you've gone from, the inception of an idea through to trying to mix. Like you're going to have a completely different perspective from what someone hearing it for the first time is going to have. But anyway, just getting more back into the process. So if I'm sent a bunch of stems, I don't know whether to say stems or send tracks now, because if I say tracks, consolidated WAVs, then people get confused and they're like, don't you mean stems? I'm like, okay, just whatever works for you, that's fine.
Your files, yeah.
Yeah. Then usually I'll kind of start with a bit of a static balance of just what is sent me, and I'll listen to the reference mix, and if they have supplied me with some references of records that they want to sound like, then I'll have those on repeat, but always kind of interspersed with my kind of palette cleanser tracks, something like Steely Dan or something, which is essentially the audio equivalent of just pure water. It's like the least kind of coloured. You can hear literally everything in perfect detail. Then it's a good palette cleanser. So I'll have a listen to the tracks, and probably go through with a little bit of a mind on the balance and automation at this point, just with clip gain, just like section by section. But this is just like tracks going straight out of the two bus, just to see, well, what is there, get an idea of where the mix could go, if there's any issues that to take care of like straight away on the like individual tracks, then it's a good way of zooming in on that. And then I usually have a little bit of a process of kind of re-engineering things, in a sense that if I'm listening through the individual tracks, I'm like, oh, hey, that would really benefit from, so there's like a bass which is really, really pure and low, and maybe a little bit of saturation might help it come across on smaller sets of speakers. Then maybe I'll try running it through some of my gear, running it through my tape machine, and kind of like go through and just see. But this is all being guided by the aesthetic of the track that is already there. Like, it wouldn't work on any track. But if there's something which like, oh, hey, this kind of fits what they're going for, I reckon I can run it through here and just kind of like try and get that feeling of being in the part of the tracking process as well at that kind of early stage. But I mean, always keeping it on a playlist underneath, so I can just flip back. I mean, 9 times out of 10, then it's like, yeah, that sounds good. But every so often, I'm like, oh god, I've really messed that up. I'll just absolutely flip back, and that's before actually getting it into my template. And at that point, my template's more just a kind of collection of various. I don't necessarily bring the whole thing in. I've got like a whole bunch of various aux sends to effects chains that I really like, and if I, having listened to the track, think, oh, hey, this would be useful, or if halfway through the mix I'll start bringing stuff in. But it's mainly just a routing thing. I have a set of like 8 stereo buses that I mix everything into, which is just kind of groups of instruments. The idea being that you want to have kind of like macro control. If you want to start with like a top-down mix, then you really, your goal is to try and make things as simple as possible to be able to make those moves. And if you're doing it at that level, then it's just the small moves make such a big difference. And it also really helps with things like band soloing EQs to be able to find like where things are clashing. Say if you can just have the vocal and say all the guitars, and mute all of the other buses and listen to those against each other and be like, well, that guitar is going to clash with the vocal there, so then you can go a layer deeper. But starting from that macro level has been really, really helpful, I think. And then so I got those the 8 bus, and then the 8 stereo buses, and then I actually do have something which I did lift a little from Andrew's mix template, which is I do mix with a rear bus as well, just across everything apart from the drums, really. But I think, yeah, I just started doing that after I first, became aware of Andrew doing it, and I just found that it seemed to just glue things together so naturally, and if you mix into it, then it just seems to hold the instrumental in this lovely kind of quite loud kind of mid-level where all of the detail still comes out, but you've got this like power that just is kind of sustained throughout it.
Hey, just want to take a quick second to tell you all about our awesome podcast sponsor, Samply, which is an app that I've been using for a while now that has made the process of mix revisions with clients so much easier. In the past, I used to get vague emails from clients about what sections needed fixing, and it was always a bit of a guessing game. But with Samply, I can upload my mixes, send my clients a link to a playlist where they can listen losslessly, and then they can add timestamped comments directly on the files. I can then import these notes into my DAW and have them perfectly synced up to my session, so there's no more guessing. Another feature that I love is their playlist embedding. Right now on my website, I have a lossless playlist of my portfolio so that any potential client can hear my work at full quality. No more crappy sounding, low resolution MP3 files. Instead, people can hear my work at its best. And the icing on the cake? Samply integrates with a ton of different services. And one of my favorite integrations is their integration with SoundFlow. With just one click, Samply can export my mix from my DAW, upload it to Samply, and then send my clients an email for where they can hear their song. One button, that's all it takes. It's a major time saver. So Samply has really streamlined my workflow, and I know that they can do it for you too. So make sure to check them out online at samply.app. And you can get 3 months off any Samply plan for free by simply applying the coupon code MYM at checkout. I think it's cool to talk about like that idea of going into the 8 buses that you have too. And I liked what you shared there about how you use those to make simple moves that apply to the entire mix, but also that idea of finding the problematic issues within your mix and within your tracks and how they rub up against each other. I think that that's a really cool way of doing it. It's certainly something that I've been doing it with my own mixes too, and it's so much easier just to mute a guitar bus when you don't want that, rather than like mute 20 guitars, So I think it's definitely a very helpful way of doing it. But I like how you explained that of like, the advantages of being able to use it to hear where things are fighting with each other. I think that's a really really great use for that.
Yeah. I think just using the EQ across across those 8 stereo buses and on the master bus to actually just like hear just band solo out like areas that you hear stuff being congested, and then you can actually like pick out like what instrument is that. You're not like looking at going through trying to find it on the individual track. You can just zoom in so much quicker that way.
As far as the rear bus goes, like how are you using the rear bus? Like what kind of settings are you typically using on that rear bus?
So it's super slow attack and super fast release. It's a 2-to-1 ratio on, I think it's the AE edition of the 1176 from UAD. And it's really kind of, I have it all, the gain staging kind of all set so that really if I'm mixing to my usual level, then it will be compressing maybe 2.5 dB kind of tops. And yeah. That's about it. But sometimes I'll push a little bit harder into that if I want to kind of like make things congeal a bit more or ease off. If there's like a really kind of like spacious, more dynamic section, then I'll pull a little bit of the input of that down. But it kind of can help if you've got like a chorus coming up, where to actually turn the output of that up a little bit as well, just like bring the instruments up a little bit, a tiny bit as a whole. Yeah, I think that's about it. It's not too complex.
That's cool. Actually, maybe we should rewind there. Like for people who might not have listened to the Andrew Sheps episode or who aren't familiar with the idea of the rear bus, what is that?
So it's essentially shared parallel compression across all of the instruments. It's not being affected by the drums. And you kind of bring it up into the mix to kind of add a little bit of extra glue amongst the instruments. If you kind of take it away, then you kind of hear things kind of jumping out outside of the rest of the instrumentation. It's just kind of like a subtle glue that kind of pulls things together. And like any other parallel compression, the benefit is that you're not you keep all of the original transient information, but you can kind of bring the overall level up, and it kind of makes it feel a bit more. And the benefit of everything kind of sharing it is that I love the idea of everything kind of interacting with one another. Yeah, I think that's kind of about it.
That's cool. I love that. Earlier, you talked about kind of your approach to low end, and you just gave us one example of how you might sometimes run things through other processing to beef stuff up. But that was one of the things that really stood out to me when I was listening to your mixes, is that I feel like you do a really great job of getting your low end to feel really big and full. And I felt like I could really feel it, but it wasn't in a way where like the mixes sounded muddy or anything like that. Like it was just there, and it was powerful. So, I'm curious to dig into your process for low end a little bit and learn more about how you would generally approach getting that low end clarity and making it still feel big, but without muddy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm so paranoid about my low mids. I do so much kind of cutting and shaping in that kind of area. I mean, in a way, that's kind of a way of making space for the kind of like harmonics of the bass. But yeah, the way I generally approach bass is with a mind to, it's going to have to translate on as many systems as possible. So if you've got this lovely low sub, you need to kind of add a little bit more harmonic information to be able to let it translate on other people's systems. As far as like the low end kind of control, I mean, I use a lot of multiband compression, a lot of sidechain multiband compression, just kind of making things fit around the kick and bass. I mean, a lot of the time, a lot of that can be solved by kind of making a bit of a call on where the energy is going to come from. So if it's something which has got a really, really big fat kick, then either if you want to have a big fat bass, then you have to, in using time and level, kind of make those fit around each other. Or you can just think, well, the bass is actually going to live, its energy is going to be a little bit further up. Or if the bass is going to be right down, then maybe you can bring the kick a little bit further up. It's just kind of balancing where the energy is going to be in the spectrum. I think the main... Again, I just use tons and tons of parallel compression as well. It's just lots and lots of small, just kind of chipping away like little refinements. And I kind of mix with quite a fair bit of saturation in the low end. Like I start like very pure, but then I find myself kind of, that's getting lost, especially as I start pulling things out from a little bit further up. Then I start feeling like there's not enough kind of warmth going on, so I kind of like push a little bit of the bass saturation to kind of like fill up that part of the spectrum. But again, it's different on every mix. In a rock mix, the way to approach bass is much different to kind of like electronic music or something. But you do like you're often a little bit, your hands are tied behind your back a little bit with like where the kick and the bass going to be like stylistically, like what kind of song is it, where is it actually kind of stylistically appropriate to put those things. So I think it's just a matter of taste, and also sidechaining is essentially the key.
Yeah. Well, you talked about the low mids, and I think that's important because a lot of people focus on low end just being like the subby stuff. And I think it is important to talk about how you're paying attention to like the higher frequencies and how that really creates that space in the mix for the low end stuff to feel big. So as far as like low mids, I guess maybe we should define that. Like what frequency range do you normally define as like low mids? Because some people have different definitions for it all, right?
I kind of start hearing kind of the low mid kind of mud kind of coming in from around like 180 to about maybe up to 500 even. I mean, it's that area is just so important because that's often where for instruments outside of bass, that's where your fundamentals are. That's kind of like where your kind of the body of your voice and like the warmth of like an acoustic guitar is, and like trying to make those things fit around each other is really the key, because everything else, if you get that bit right, then everything else can kind of work itself out around it. Like you can do some shaping kind of higher up the spectrum, but if you sort out your low mids and like maybe use saturation to kind of like bring things like brighter elements to things, then yeah, that's you're really there. I would say I find myself cutting like 500 hertz out of most mixes. For some reason, that's something that's somewhere that things just seem to congeal, and I find that often I'll be thinking, well, I can't quite hear the vocal as much as I want to in this particular part of the song, and I just find myself just cutting a little bit of 500 hertz, either at the across the 8 stereo buses or actually on the master, just at that point, and suddenly you just have this like presence and clarity just kind of gets pushed through. I mean, you just got to be aware of masking at all times. I mean, low masking, high. If you've got something which you want to try and get through higher up the spectrum, then there might be a whole bunch of energy coming from something that you don't actually need masking it. Like, you've got to, I mean, it's useful to think about using your filters like quite early on, just thinking, well, where is this going to actually fit in the spectrum? Because if you just leave things completely open, then you might find that you've got loads of low frequency information coming all of a sudden, which is just going to get in the way of your, even up to your vocal.
That's cool. Yeah, it kind of ties into like something else that I was thinking when I was listening to your mixes, which is that I feel like your mixes also have a lot of great depth to them. Like, they feel very three-dimensional, and to me it felt like there was a lot of you had contrast where you would have things that were like very forward in the mix, and then there were things that were further back in the mix, and some of that was maybe because some stuff was a little bit brighter and some stuff was a little bit darker. And so to me, I felt like that really added this like very immersive feel to the tracks, and you could really get a lot of depth, like forward and backwards wise. So, you know, it sounds sort of like a lot of that has to do with your frequency masking issue and how you treat that and how you're making some things brighter and darker. But is there anything else that you generally consider when it comes to even like starting with setting up your levels or creating that space and depth? Like, what other issues are going into those decisions?
Absolutely. But as far as like setting levels go, and actually I'm glad that you said that because it is an important point, I kind of generally start with everything kind of hitting about like -14. I kind of use, I think it's like K14 metering in Pro Tools. So, you know, if something is kind of hitting the top of the green, then that's where I know that's where -14 is going to be. And that is because I use a lot of like analog modeled plugins, and a lot of them, you know, faithfully recreate bits of analog gear, which were set for kind of -14, the equivalent to -14 dBFS, to be their kind of optimum operating level. And I feel if you're just like hitting plugins really hard, then you know, even if it doesn't seem like they're doing much, then you're going to be adding all of this extra saturation that you don't want. But yeah, I generally mix really quiet and then just make it up kind of later on in the chain. As far as depth goes, I think as far as like space and reverbs and everything, I kind of, again, it is masking. You only really want bits of the bits of the reverb that aren't going to interfere with anything else. I've kind of recently started sidechain multiband compressing my reverb returns from stuff that is being sent to it. So doing a kind of a parallel sidechain, which then feeds the sidechain of the multiband compressor. So everything that's being kind of sent to the reverb, it's just pulling out those specific frequencies, and everything else is kind of being brought up around it. And with quite a relatively, well, the attack and release kind of tailored to the particular song or particular part of the song, the tempo. But I found that meant I could actually push more reverb up without it getting in the way of the instruments. So that's been something I've been doing recently. When it comes to depth and width, you've just got to think that things only sound wide or deep because it's being contrasted against something which is narrow or shallow. Like, it's all just contrast. I mean, things can only be as wide as maybe your headphones or the speakers that are there. And the reason why something might sound huge is because you've got that contrast. You've got things which, I mean, there's some amazing mixes I've heard which are all really, really quite close and quite mono, but then it may be just the ambience or a few small elements which are actually filling out that extra space. And then maybe when there's a large part of the song, then it suddenly fills that space. And if it's been filled the whole time, then that's just going to seem like it's been kind of wide the whole time. I think like working into that contrast is really important, and playing with that. because you kind of like set the parameters that you're working within spatially, and then you think, well, I can't just start there. I have to start small to be able to get big. And that's over time, like throughout the song, you use that to bounce off the arrangement of the song. I think once I kind of discovered that, it kind of opened up a whole new world to actually being able to make people perceive width. Because, early on you'd think, oh yeah, I'm just going to use some stereo widening plugins or something, but it's just like, I'm just going to suddenly just throw loads of out of phase stuff into the mix, and it's just going to sound kind of dull in mono. Not that many people listen in mono anymore, but it is still very important. But yeah, it's all about contrast. I mean, things are only loud because other things are quiet. Things are only wide because other things are narrow. And yeah, I do find that sometimes when I'm doing like mix notes with people, and it's like, oh, you know, that could come up, and it's like, well, actually, mixing is a lot more of just more of a subtractive process, if anything. Like if you want to make something feel louder or fuller, then you've got to make something else, or another part of the track or another element of the track, be quieter and thinner. I mean, it's all just, it's almost like there's like once you have your set first balance, then to take away something is always pushing up its opposite, you know?
You're prioritizing the tracks.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I love that. No, I think that's really important. And there's a couple things that you touched on there that I think are good to talk about, which is that, you know, I think a lot of people learn about like the LCR method of panning. And so everyone does tend to go one extreme or the other, or in the center. And, you know, but you're right. It's like, well, how much wider can you go once you've already gone 100%, right? Like, yeah, you're going to use some stereo wideners, and what is that doing? It's kind of messing things up, right? So I think it is cool to hear you talk about how, like, it's okay to, like, keep things a little bit more narrow and then have other elements that are all the way wide, and use those contrasting positions in the stereo field to create some of that clarity and that width. And I think that's definitely cool. And I feel like when I was listening to some of your mixes too, like I was noticing that where like there were parts where it would feel like the drums were a little bit tighter, but then like the ambience, which was kind of like one of the really cool driving factors of the song, would be like hard left and right. And that was kind of cool. It kept things very immersive. So yeah, I'm glad to hear that that is something that you're doing purposely, and it makes it make a lot of sense. Do you find yourself using a lot of automation in your mixes to play with that width?
Yeah, for sure. I think, say like sometimes right at the very beginning of the process, then I can kind of hear, I try and just using clip gain at that point, just shape a little bit, try and just, where sometimes it's already perfect, in which case you don't have to worry with it, but if something needs to be pulled down to be able to give the next section a little bit more impact, then I'll do it at that stage. But I'd say there's that bit right at the very beginning, and then if while I'm working, then it's after that original balance, work kind of sequentially through the song, just so I can kind of like get a feeling of the kind of contour of the track to make sure that that's fulfilling its intention. And at that point, then maybe it'll be kind of rides into effects buses and maybe little volume automation. But I do think that if you kind of get the spectral balance right, then you find yourself having to do less and less volume automation at the very end, because things kind of everything kind of has its own space, and a lot of the time it's being played by great musicians that have got their own dynamics, and like maybe sometimes you want to try and massage a little bit, some kind of like someone's like crescendoing towards a section, you might kind of massage that if it doesn't quite get there. But a lot of the time I kind of trust the musicians to have kind of like balanced themselves. And obviously this isn't on every mix. Sometimes you have to go in and try and create something that isn't necessarily quite there, but then generally automation of level might do a little bit kind of right at the end. I do a fair amount of frequency automation though, which is probably more what you were hinting at. But yeah, I think section by section, and also just kind of linearly across the track, I'm usually trying to have everything reacting to everything else that's going on. Because I mean, you can't just really set and forget EQ unless it's kind of just overall shaping. Because, you know, there might be something which works really well in one section, but then you've got another part coming in and you want to suddenly make space for. So I'm quite kind of fastidious about only having instruments fulfill their role at the time that they're needed, and then if you can take as much away from it as you possibly can while still having it audible and fulfilling its role at that point in the song, then you suddenly open up this gap for new material to come in, or for you to be able to hear smaller details. Yeah, you'd be surprised how much you can pull out of the original tracks, and still your brain kind of fills in the gaps sometimes. I think it's so like you don't actually even really have to have the fundamental of a tone to still kind of perceive it, and your brain is very, very good at, once you've kind of introduced the role of a particular source, then kind of holding on to it and still feeling like it is there. And that just really, really helps with giving everything its own space. But it changes all the time. Like, it's not just a snapshot. It's a moving image,
I love that. I think that's a really, really cool approach to it. And it makes a lot of sense. Like, I guess, going back to my question about depth, like, I think that makes... That's why I was feeling things were like moving kind of forward and backwards in the mix, is because they probably literally were, like, between volume and just things getting a little bit darker or brighter depending on what else was going on in the song. So yeah, I think that is a really cool approach that a lot of people don't necessarily cover. Like, a lot of people talk about, like, just kind of set and forget your EQ and maybe automate volumes, but that's maybe only part of the equation when it comes to creating that depth and some of that contrast as well. So yeah, I think that's very cool that you bring that up.
Yeah, nice. I mean, yeah, in my head, like, it's obviously nothing that's taking away from the intention of the track. I mean, these are only like very, very small moves. I mean, it's maximum like a couple of dB most of the time, but just those little moves can just make such a difference in, like, space.
Yeah. That's awesome. There was one thing you mentioned at the very beginning that I want to touch on, which is that you talked about how one of your early influences was Pink Floyd, and you actually got to work with David Gilmour.
I know.
And so I wanted to ask about that, because I think that's a really cool full circle moment for you. So, how did that opportunity come up?
So, yeah, I mean, the ridiculousness of that is not lost on me whatsoever. But yeah, that came about through my work with Charlie Andrew, amazing producer who David got in touch with to work on his new record, and I think he just had heard some of the stuff that we'd done together and some of the stuff that Charlie had done before, and really liked it, and was like, I mean, massive credit to the guy. I mean, he's just like always. I mean, it'd be so easy to just be like, yeah, I'll kind of, I don't know, make a record like I have before. That's been great, but I mean, he's just always trying to push and be different and do something that challenges him, which is amazing. I like, massive respect. But yeah, I think Pink Floyd was a massive for me growing up, especially with my dad, and just being in the same room and recording guitar solos. I mean, it's pretty insane. And I mean, we had some of the. We were lucky enough to have access to some amazing studios. We went to British Grove Studios and Salvation Studios down in Brighton, and the obviously standard of players. I mean, I got to record Steve Gadd playing drums. I mean, what more could you want? It's I mean, not only Steve Gadd playing drums, but with C12s as overheads and through a TG desk and all of these things. And, given a toy shop like that to play with, it's just kind of, quite maximal with the setup. I'm generally quite maximal with the setup as far as numbers of mics and numbers of options, but it's better to have the options at that stage than options later down the line, I think. I mean, a lot of the time you can find something that sounds incredible, commit it, move on, and like that's now a part of the process. But yeah, so me and after the first while of recording, and by this point I'd kind of gotten to a point where I was mixing a lot of Charlie's productions and engineering most of them as well, and it just kind of fit that we sat on David's boat, and for many hours. In fact, I slept there quite a bit of the time. But it's the most amazing control room with ATC monitors, and surrounded by fantastic gear, and just having the ability to come up with a few just like not effects chains, but like signal paths to kind of utilize across things, like one that we'd use the vocals, one that we'd use to kind of like sum guitars together, stuff that we'd use for synths, and it was all like through a Fairchild and lovely MIDI cues, and just having the option of, I think the process of, rather than just having those set as plugins, like once we're very, very happy with the edit and that nothing's going to come through, then actually just finding something that feels really good in the room and committing to it, and it's like that is what that sound is now, and then move on, because if you're stuck down the line with like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of options, like how can you ever finish something? Something felt good at that time, and I mean you have the ability to change things, essentially anything into anything nowadays. It's like you can do so much. It's kind of quite a nice kind of filter to put things through, to be like, yes, we feel great about this, and that's how it shall stay.
That's awesome.
I mean, it sounds simple, but I think it's just incredibly effective.
Yeah, when you have the gear, you can have fun with it as well.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious to ask about that. Like, you being a fan of his, and obviously him having such a massive musical career, and being so innovative throughout his career, like, did any of that back catalog play any influence in your approach to working with him? Because I would imagine, like, you being a fan, you'd probably want to tap into some of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of tried to shut that down as much as possible in my head. In terms of, I think maybe it was the first time that I met him that I was just kind of nervous, to say the very least. But I was trying to downplay, because really, I think, in order to do your job well, you kind of just have to treat someone like you would treat anyone, because that will affect your decisions, and it's not the intention of what he was doing, I don't think. But definitely, it's been a part of shaping my tastes. So there's no way that you can get away from that. And actually, just seeing some of the equipment and instruments used on those records and things, and being like, it'd be cool to kind of do something like that, but maybe do it in a bit of a different way, like record rotor cabinets, but with a binaural head 3 times, and pitch one down and pitch the other side down, and get this amazing chorus. I mean, it's only one very small part of it, but it was it was a long process, and we were afforded time to also be experimental, which is what I really loved about those records as well. I mean, the Pink Floyd records, I mean, they were right at the very, very forefront of stuff all the way along. And I mean, I was listening to Dark Side when I was a little kid, was like it was an awakening. So yeah, it's difficult. I can't possibly say that it didn't affect my approach, but I really tried to just stay very, very unbiased, because that's not what we were going for.
Makes total sense. Yeah, you gotta keep their vision alive and make that happen, as opposed to, like, trying to make it live in the past and that kind of thing. I mean, and as an engineer mixer, then it's kind of, you're there to be an unbiased set of ears as much as possible, and just react to what people want, and say, well, I mean, my favourite feeling is when, say, a producer and artist be like, oh yes, we want to make it kind of sound a bit like that record, or a bit like that, or just a colour or a shape or something, and then you just got to have that back catalogue of kind of different possible sounds and approaches, and then come up with something, and then they're just like, yeah, that works. That is a worm on the side just wriggling around. I've genuinely had that one before, but I mean, that's such a great feeling, and to be able to, like, just create that with technology. Love that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So then at the end of the day, like, in your mind, what ultimately makes a great mix? How do you know when you've done your job right?
I'd say the first time that I can come at a mix completely fresh, probably like first thing in the morning and sit and just feel that the music has actually reached what the artist was intending it to, and that I can hear everything that I want to hear to the extent that I want to hear it. Because a lot of mixes actually require there to be a lot of fighting and gelling and anger and all these things. Not everything can be beautiful, but you kind of make those calls in the process as you go along. But I think, I think it's just when I feel like I can hear the song like I did the first time again, I suppose. Like the way that the impact that it had when I feel like I still have that. Like I've not taken anything away from that, but I'm happy with the way that it sounds overall.
That's cool. I like that.
Yeah.
That brings it full circle. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. Well, Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate all of your time and great answers as well. And it's been awesome to learn more about your process and your way of thinking about your projects. If people want to learn more about you, maybe even work with you, like what's the best way for them to do that?
I'm not really a massive social media person. I'm on Instagram, Matt Glasbey. I have a website, which is mattglasbey.com, which is literally just a bunch of records that I've worked on. If you were to follow me, you would probably get essentially just many posts about all of the signed bands that I like working with and stuff that's coming out, and that's generally about it. But through my website, you'll be able to get my email, and let's just chat.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, man. It's been good fun.
Awesome. So that was my interview with Matt Glasbey, and I really enjoyed that. I loved learning more about his process, especially as it relates to creating clarity and contrast and separation in a mix. And I thought that it was really important that he talked about how routing can even play a big role in that. You know, everything as far as creating his instrument buses and how he uses that to solo tracks to listen for masking issues and stuff like that. Not only is that just a faster workflow to have tracks routed that way so that you can mix on a more top-down level, but also to be able to then isolate things and figure out frequency masking issues and then utilize those buses to create more contrast as far as things being darker or brighter and automating things throughout the mix. I think that's a really, really cool approach. And when you listen to his mixes, like I said in the interview, like you can hear things moving forward and backwards and getting wider and narrower. And there's a lot of movement. And it's cool to hear that a lot of that just has to do with his approach to automating EQs and making things brighter, darker, that kind of thing, or panning things narrower or wider. Those are simple moves that I think a lot of people forget we can do. Like a lot of people just focus on making static mixes that sound good. That's part of the challenge, is like making a mix that everything has clarity. And if you can do that on a static level, that's great. But then it's like, take that up a notch. How do you make your mixes sound more exciting? And by having all of that movement in your tracks, as far as frequencies and depth and volumes and stuff like that, that's really what separates an amateur sounding mix from something that is top tier. So definitely give his mixes a listen, because they're great. And I think once you listen to them and you start focusing on the stuff that he talked about in this interview, you're going to hear it all in action, and it's going to make a lot of sense. And I think that if you start to implement that into your own mixes, you're going to see some drastic improvement in your own tracks as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed that, and I thought that he shared a ton of really good stuff. Now, if you enjoyed that episode, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And if you're looking for help with your tracks, if you want someone that can listen to your tracks and offer you advice on what you can be doing with things like EQ, compression, if you're not sure about how to implement all the stuff that we talked about in today's episode, and you want someone who can listen to your tracks and guide you through the recording, editing, and mixing process to make sure that you're taking the right steps necessary and actually implementing everything properly, then that is exactly what I help out with inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. And this month, I'm opening up some new spots. I would love to work with you inside. So if you're interested in learning more about that, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/Amplitude. And then, I'd love to hop on a call with you. I'd love to learn more about your goals, your processes, to see what's working for you, what's not working for you, and to give you more clarity and more focus on how to see the biggest improvements in the least amount of time. So once again, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/Amplitude, and you can find all the details of that program there. And with that said, we're reaching the end of this episode, but I want to give one last special shout out to Samply, who is our podcast sponsor. Samply is an awesome company. They have definitely made my life a lot easier as far as dealing with clients and dealing with mix revisions. So definitely make sure to check them out online at samply.app. If you're working with other clients, they are going to be a major time saver and save you so much back and forth and stress and all that stuff. So again, definitely check them out at samply.app. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.